Hi, everyone. Welcome to Education for Flourishing, Pursuing Purpose in the Professions. This webinar is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. The goal of the initiatives is for scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character in pre-professional and professional education. This initiative is funded through a generous grant from the Kern Family Foundation. I am Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns. I am also host for this series. At any point during the program, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will turn to those audience questions around 12:40. Be assured there is a background stage team that will address any technical difficulties that arise during the next hour. And with that, in our first webinar of 2023, we're delighted to welcome the multi-talented scholar and educator, Michael Lamb, to talk with us today on hope and character. And for anyone who's interested in questions of character or virtue, who hasn't been living under a rock this past year, you will know what an enormous treat it is to have Michael with us here today. Michael Lamb is the F.M. Kirby Foundation Chair of Leadership and Character, the Executive Director of the Program for Leadership and Character, and Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Wake Forest University. He is also a research fellow with the Oxford Character Project. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a BA in political science from Rhodes College, and a second BA in philosophy and theology from the University of Oxford, where he also studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Michael's research focuses on the ethics of citizenship and the role of virtues in public life. This year, in 2022, he produced two really significant volumes. The first, A Commonwealth of Hope, Augustine's Political Thought, and he co-edited a volume, Cultivating Virtue in the University. So for people who haven't seen them and want to get them, we're going to put them in the chat. I highly recommend both. Michael's broader interests include virtue ethics, leadership and character development, religion and politics, ethic and public policy, and politics and literature. He's taught interdisciplinary courses in politics, ethics, and religion at Oxford, Princeton, Rhodes, and Wake Forest. He is the recipient of several teaching awards. A political theorist with experience in actual political politics, practical politics, Michael has advised universities on character and civic engagement and served as chief of staff for campaigns for state senate, governor, and US Congress in his home state of Tennessee. At the University of Oxford, he helped to launch the Oxford Character Project, which helps graduate students in various fields, including government, law, medicine, and business, and academia, think about the role of ethics in their professions. He's currently working with the Wake Forest community and campuses nationally to develop programs in leadership and character. So welcome, Michael.
Great. I'm very grateful to be here, Suzanne. It's great to have a chance to talk about character and hope today with all of you.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping to have a fairly broad-ranging conversation to give you an opportunity to talk about the trajectory of your life, thought, and work as a scholar and educator. In particular, I'm hoping to give you a chance to share with us some insight from your most recent book, A Commonwealth of Hope, and connect it to your work as an educator and really what I understand to be somewhat of an activist around the integration of character into higher education. Sound reasonable?
That sounds great.
Okay, great. So I want to jump right in with A Commonwealth of Hope. So I have this habit where I start every scholarly book with the footnotes and with the acknowledgements. And so first, wow, more than 100 pages of footnotes. So great. And it helps me get a sense of both the intellectual and personal drivers of someone's work. But one of the things I noted in the acknowledgements is that you have this really beautiful sort of dedication to your parents. And you talk about how your mother introduced you to books and service, and your father introduced you to work and sacrifice. You also talk about how there is this thread of the work of Augustine in your scholarship throughout. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this work in relationship to sort of the trajectory of life. Rumor has it you grew up on a farm in Tennessee. Has that shaped this work, or is it really sort of the kinds of courses you took beginning as an undergraduate, and this has been a thread throughout? So if you could just give us a little bit of the flavor of where this comes from you as a person.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, I really, I grew up on a farm in Tennessee, about an hour south of Nashville, and had my own crops when I was 13. And so I was very involved in sort of being on the farm and really being active in farming. And that really taught me a lot about family and about hard work, and I mean, about character, because on the farm, character becomes crucial. It's a kind of resilience in the face of difficulty. It's a lot of hard work and a real sense of doing things together. As a farm family, we had to rely on each other all the time, and our uncles and our cousins. We exchanged labor across different farms to help us achieve harvests in the fall and bring the crops in. So I think for us, it really was a communal effort that taught me the importance of the ways that you need character to really align around certain common goods, which has been a theme of my own sort of aspiration. And I think my parents have been crucial exemplars for me. My mother did teach me about books. She loves reading and taught me about how to really embrace the intellectual journey. But she also was a really great example of service to me and of real kindness. My mother was one in town who often would do things for people behind the scenes without anybody knowing it, and really taught us the importance of serving others. And in her first words to me in my baby book, when I was still a day old, she wrote a wonderful letter to me that she sent to me when I was in college that said, "Dear Michael, hope you become a kind person, a compassionate and forgiving person, one who helps those who are less fortunate than yourself." So those are very first words to me as a child. And so I think that vision for me of who she wanted me to become, and her deep commitment to helping me become that, was crucial to my own development as a person of character who values service, compassion, and kindness, among other virtues. My father was a real exemplar of hard work and sacrifice. He worked in Nissan, making engines for Nissan trucks for almost 38 years, and also did work on the farm. And so I see him come home after a long day at work, standing on concrete for 9 hours and a 45-minute commute back, change his boots and go back out again on the farm. And so that real sort of commitment to serving the family and helping provide for us was a real example of hard work. But he also made time to coach our Little League team and serve on the school board and serve as president of the Lions Club. So a real kind of civic engagement from both my parents in different ways. And so for me, that really shaped me profoundly. So I knew early on, given my family, given my own tradition growing up, that character was very important to my own life. And it was college that gave me sort of the language and the ideas that helped me capture that. So I had some great courses from my first year course called Search for Values, where I first read philosophy and reading Aristotle and Plato and others around the idea of virtue and character, to the second year course called Hunger, Plenty, and Justice, where it was really examining, do we have a duty to aid the hungry? And how can our both deep study of philosophy from Aristotle to Kant to John Rawls, and our deep engagement in service learning in the community. I was doing a lot of work in soup kitchens in Memphis and understanding sort of Meals on Wheels routes and how hunger really manifests in different ways. That really shaped my sense of how you can combine sort of deep intellectual desire for knowledge and wisdom with a real sort of practical engagement in the community. I was a service scholar in college, where I spent 10 hours a week doing community service or leadership around the community. And my experiences working with people in the soup kitchens or on Habitat for Humanity builds or in local schools shaped my sense of our own social community and some of the challenges we face, and also how we can begin to address them both individually and systematically. And so I think that experience of combining deep engagement and citizenship with real intellectual sort of pursuit of wisdom, I think really forms who I am in many ways. And so I really sort of credit both my family and my education for that process of refinement and integration to the kind of approach I have now, where I'm really trying to think about ways in which our traditions and our knowledge might inform our pursuit of wisdom, and how we can then not just hold that or share that in very small ways, but share it more broadly to help all of our students and others think about how to live a good life in their various contexts.
Great. So you in this new volume, you framed hope as a virtue. Can you unpack that for me? It seems there's lots of language of hope right out and about right now, and I think people are approaching it and thinking of it slightly differently. And I think this is a very particular framing. Could you kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think we talk a lot about hope in our popular discourse, and we often equate hope with optimism or this kind of positive or sunny disposition toward certain outcomes. And so we often expect that if you're hopeful, you're always thinking positively about what's going to happen or what outcomes you might achieve. And often hope can be like optimism, but they're not the same concept. And I think we make some important mistakes if we equate them together. I think optimism often implies a more confident or certain expectation that certain outcomes will come about. Hope is much more realistic, I think, as a concept. It focuses on desiring future goods that are possible, but not yet certain or even likely. We can have hope for things that aren't even likely, but they're still possible in some way. So I think there's one key difference that often is not noted in our discourse. I think a second one is that we often think about hope as this attitude or emotion or mood that kind of comes over us and maybe consumes us and motivates us to pursue a certain good or goal. And it is that. I think hope is an attitude, emotion, or mood. But the danger of this conceiving it as a mood or emotion is that we can hope for the wrong things or hope in the wrong ways or hope too much or too little for certain goods. And so we need some kind of virtue of character that can actually help regulate and guide and direct our hopes toward the right objects in the right ways and in the right people to help us achieve them. So I think what you see is a need for a virtue to help regulate these emotions and attitudes. And so I think that's where the helpful virtue tradition comes in to offer us some concepts and language around how hope as a virtue might help us. And I think if you look at the research on this, there's been a lot of work on hope as a virtue, but it's not been done by political theorists often. It's been done by theologians who have a whole tradition for years and centuries to think about hope as a virtue. And so I've been really interested in how those concepts might inform not only our theological imagination, but even our political imagination. How can we learn from that tradition about what hope as a virtue means, and then extend that to our democratic community and find ways that people from different backgrounds and traditions can really cultivate the virtue of hope and find common hopes together.
Great. So why do this through the work of Augustine, and why this sort of desire to offer this corrective to his pessimism?
Yeah, so Augustine is, as you note, one of the great pessimists, at least people think, in the Western tradition. And he often has been seen as someone who focuses only on evil and darkness and really focuses on the limits of politics, not its possibilities. And I was initially writing a larger book on democratic hope as a virtue. And what I found was that many people who were critics of democratic hope were Augustinians. So you had realists such as Reinhold Niebuhr or Judith Shklar, who were really criticizing much aspiration in politics at all. It should be very limited, very sort of restrained. And they often cited Augustine's authority to make that critique. In the church, many theologians such as Stanley Hauerwas or John Milbank were also citing Augustine's authority to encourage Christians to really focus on being the church, not being active in politics, at least in its current forms. And so I saw both sides sort of engaging Augustine's thought to challenge democratic hope. And I saw many democratic theorists sort of seeing Augustine as a pessimist and therefore dismissing him as a relevant resource for political theory. And so as I began to read more of Augustine's work and to really see beyond just the City of God, most political theorists read only City of God and really only Book 19, which is a very dark and sort of cautionary book about political life. But they ignore some of the places in his thought, especially his sermons and letters, that are full of more explicit discussion of hope, and a kind of hope that actually is not simply naive optimism, but a realistic hope that I think was very useful for his context, but also could be for ours. And so what I really wanted to do was to sort of show the ways in which reading Augustine more holistically in his own context and seeing how the virtue of hope might operate in that context can give us a different way to interpret his thought, and therefore to engage the way that people draw on his authority currently to inform politics, but also uncover resources that might help us think about hope in our own time. And I think his idea of that hope is a virtue that avoids both presumption or false hope and despair, the lack of hope, is a really helpful concept. And I think that's a concept you don't really see before Augustine in the history of Western philosophy. And so I think he gives us a way to think about that virtue that's really unique and it can help us in our own time think about how we can avoid both presumption and despair in our politics.
Great. Super helpful. So a couple of pieces there. So one of the things I kept thinking about as I read your book is really the relationship between pessimism and hope, right? And that what's interesting to me in the work of right in his work is that there's both, right? And it seems that right, they have to go together,
Right.
right? And that especially if they're a virtue, right? That in this framing, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think much of the debate is kind of fragmented. You're either a pessimist or you're
Right.
an optimist, right? And I think
Right.
hope enables you to almost capture that pessimism space within it when
Right.
it's a virtue. So could you
Right.
just talk a little bit more about that? Also, then this sort of this sort of trajectory between presumption and despair, right? That you talk
Sure.
about repeatedly. Maybe just flesh those bits out a little for us.
Yeah, I think we often think about hope and optimism being the same, and therefore they're opposed to pessimism. These being this binary, we have two options: you're an optimist or a pessimist. You're not either or. You have to kind of be one or the other. And I think that really leaves out a whole space in between that's more nuanced, and also gives us a bit more sort of room to imagine what possibilities might be. And so I think, if hope is a virtue, it has to avoid the vices that might oppose it. And I mentioned them before: presumption and despair. Despair may be the most obvious one. We need to avoid the lack of hope. And if we do despair about a certain good, we actually then give up on achieving it, or give up on working toward realizing it. So despair really calls us to withdraw from a good that we might actually be able to achieve if we actually ordered our action toward its pursuit. So that's one obvious vice, but I think presumption is the other one, and it's the less often visible vice in some way, but often even more pernicious in its effects. And so presumption really is presuming that a certain good will be possible, or that a certain outcome is very likely without us having to do anything to achieve it. Or we presume that certain individuals or groups might help us achieve a good, and they might not have the ability to do that for us in certain ways. So I think there's a way in which presumption can also breed complacency and apathy. And so if we do want to avoid presumption, we have to be very alert to the actual challenges we face, the problems that we might encounter, the risk involved. And I think what might be called pessimism, being alert to those challenges and being aware that these things might not actually occur, and that these are real difficulties we have to overcome, can help us actually have the right kind of hope. So if we have hope without lament or recognition of our challenges, we might risk presumption. But if we have lament without hope, we also risk despair. There's a danger of only lamenting our problems and not actually figuring out ways to work to overcome them, or finding examples of people actually doing that work on the ground to change an outcome. So I do think we need both. We need both hope and this kind of realistic assessment of challenges in order to have the virtue of hope and to avoid presumption and despair. I think without that combination of realism and hope, realism and aspiration, we miss out on possibilities that we can imagine a better future for ourselves.
Great. So early on in the book, you introduced this relationship between love, faith, and hope. Can you talk a little bit about why those three elements go together in your argument?
Yeah, so Augustine here is really drawing on St. Paul, who thinks about faith, hope, and love as the great triad of the Christian virtues and the Christian tradition. And so he's trying to think about ways in which he can take, I think, Paul's sort of thoughts about faith, hope, and love, and also integrate them with his own Roman philosophical framework as virtues. And so I think what he really tries to do is show the ways in which we need all three virtues, he thinks, to live a good life. For him, it's a life as a Christian ordered toward God, but also ordered in love of God and neighbor. So it's not just an eternal focus or otherworldly focus, it's actually ordered toward this worldly good and this worldly love. And so he thinks that we need faith to be able to pursue certain goods and believe in them. And faith for him is not simply a matter of belief, as we often think about faith today. It's a matter of trust. And we can trust in others to help us do things without knowing exactly if they will come about or they can be achieved. And so that kind of trust is vital to ground hope. Without that trust that something is possible and that someone can help us achieve it, then there's no real ground for our hope. So hope relies on faith to ground our hope. And love, I think, is for Augustine the motivating desire. He says it kind of bundles of love. We are people who love, and out of our loves have these desires for goods that order us in certain ways toward certain goals and certain purposes. And so hope is a kind of love, a desire for a particular kind of good. It's often a future good, things that we don't have yet possessed, and it's good we don't yet see or can't yet realize. And so if we do care about directing our desires toward those goods, we need a virtue like hope to help us achieve them. Without sort of ordering ourselves toward the future and having the resilience and resolve to overcome difficulties that might inhibit our pursuits of these objects of love, then we won't actually achieve them. So he thinks that we need faith, hope, and love working together to achieve the ultimate good. And I think this is really important for us now, even for those who may not accept Augustine's own Christian vision. I think there are ways that we can think about democratic virtues of faith, hope, and love. So if we think about our own context, we need evidence that might ground our democratic hope. And so we need some kind of democratic faith that says that certain kinds of democratic goods are possible and that trusting in our fellow citizens can actually help us achieve them. So we can look back to our history, to civil rights movement, for example, or other movements from abolitionism to women's suffrage, to see these people hoping in each other to achieve a democratic good that looked very difficult and often was unseen. So they had kind of a faith in each other that gave them the trust to actually do difficult things together. And that sort of that common trust, that common hope then united them in bonds of friendship and love. And as they built better friendships across difference, especially, those friendships really also reinforce their hope and reinforce their faith. And so you see these three virtues working together in our democratic history to really enable movements to happen that might not have been possible without those three virtues. And so I do think there are ways we can understand that framework to help us think about our common life and the virtues we need now as democratic citizens to flourish as individuals and as a community.
Wonderful. So I want to turn a little bit to sort of this line of thinking, because you really open the book talking about contemporary politics and, sort of, right, to bring Augustine into that conversation. And certainly probably isn't what people pull from most quickly, right? So how do you take this argument and think of yourself in your former political roles, bringing that into the political space and the public sphere in a translational way?
Right. Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I think it requires a real sense of what our real aims and ideas are, and also who our audiences are. One thing I learned on the campaign trail, working for a year and a half in different campaigns in Tennessee, was the ways in which many citizens have these concerns about our common life. They want to hope. They really want to sort of order their lives toward these democratic goods, but it's often difficult given what they see in their own communities. And they face hardship, they face injustice, they face real poverty or other economic insecurity. And so I think there's a way in which if we care about justice and we care about peace and we care about equality, we need hope to be able to achieve those difficult goods, because obviously we have a lot of work to do that. And if we think they're not possible, then we'll give up. And if we think we already have them, we actually won't do the work we need to achieve them and secure them, even against threat. So even if we have a good, it's not necessarily certain that we'll keep it or maintain it. And so I think as we think about our democracy, there are threats to our democracy now that require democratic hope, not just to achieve goods, but actually to preserve the institutions and goods we do have. And so I think hope is not only a sort of a matter of change, it's also conserving things that are good to conserve as well, and protecting them from violation or from ways that might inhibit that good. So how do you translate this into a contemporary political vernacular? I do think that too often our rhetoric around hope on the campaign trail or even in sort of academic circles can either focus only on the problems that we see and generate fear about our current moment to sort of ignite action to oppose it. Or they can paint this nostalgic picture of our life as citizens in ways that are quite presumptuous. The fear of politics often promotes despair. and tries to get you to act out of despair or desperation to change something. The presumption politics often relies on nostalgia and a narrative about our history that ignores some of the difficult realities of that history and our current challenges in facing them. I think recent events has really shown that our history is quite complex and difficult, and we have to acknowledge that history to really understand a true sense of ourselves. And so I do think there are ways that you can have hope and aspiration while also acknowledging the problems. I think one thing I think Augustine offers us is really not only a conceptual framework for this, but also a rhetorical framework. He's often very good he's a trained rhetorician for years before he became a theologian and bishop. And so he knows rhetoric really well. It's part of his Roman education. And so he knows how to use rhetorical devices and structures to shape the character and emotions of his audiences. So he often will give a very sort of poignant and trenchant analysis of our political and social challenges, our evils, he calls them, that might really unsettle and chasten our presumption. If we read Augustine, we can't be optimistic about social life. We have to be really aware of its difficulties and its threats. But he often will take us into that. But rather than leaving us there in despair about what we see, he takes us out of that despair by giving us grounds for hope and showing the ways in which the goodness around us might help us actually achieve and realize certain important human goods. And so I think this way through presumption and despair into hope is a really helpful sort of rhetorical strategy for us. And you see it, for example, now in climate change communication. There's a lot of climate doom out there in the world, and for good reason. We have a lot of reasons to be quite concerned about our planet and what's happening there. But if we only focus on the problems and don't actually give examples, positive examples of people actually working to address them and making progress on those, we can then be tempted toward despair and not have hope to actually address those important issues. So how do you pair sort of realistic appraisal of our current moment to avoid presumption with enough sort of appraisal of the realities of goodness and possibility to also avoid despair, and therefore motivate a kind of realistic hope toward these important goods? I think Augustine gives us a kind of rhetorical framework for that can help us as social critics and as academics be aware of our challenges, but also not give in to despair as we face them.
Wonderful. So as I read your work and see the kinds of things programmatically that you're doing at Wake Forest, for you, is this a political project in some sense? It does have this pretty strong social movement feel in trying to change the way people are thinking about issues, how they're prioritizing different things in higher education. Do you think of it as a political project, or is that something I'm imputing?
Well, that's a great question. I think about it as political in the broadest sense of political, not as a partisan project, not as an electoral project. I think we often think about politics now as a purely electoral or institutional kind of concept. And I prefer the ancient idea that Augustine and Aristotle and others held that politics as being about what serves the common good and how can we sort of do the work we need together through institutions, but also through our own action to serve the common good. So I do think in that sense, I would say that it's a political in the broadest sense of trying to think about ways that universities can help serve our common good and help citizens and human beings develop the virtues and capacities to do that work well and to order them toward not just their own purposes as individuals, but toward the common purposes that we might share together. And so in that sense, I do think it is a civic project, I think, overall. And I do think it's important that we recognize that. In my own life, for example, after working in campaigns, I came back to graduate school to finish my PhD. And I thought for a long time I might want to be involved in government or politics personally, and considered that as a possible kind of vocational path for me. And I think the campaign really taught me the challenges of electoral politics and of that form of politics. And so I was back in the library reading for my dissertation, and I read a great dialogue from Xenophon of Socrates engaging this sophist interlocutor Antiphon, who was in politics. And Socrates has been very critical of Antiphon for not being just and not doing what he should do in politics. And Antiphon becomes very frustrated and says, Socrates, listen, buddy, you talk about how bad we are as politicians, but why don't you do it yourself, Socrates? Why don't you walk the walk, run for office, Socrates? And Socrates says in response, how now, Antiphon, is it better to be one private person in politics or to take pains to turn out or teach as many competent politicians as possible? And so I'd added that citizens. How do we teach as many competent politicians and citizens, leaders and citizens as possible to help us serve our common good? And so for me, my own sense as a teacher is to help prepare human beings to be the kinds of people and citizens that we need to serve the common good. And I think a focus on character is a really important part of that. And I think for me, think about the ways that we can cultivate the virtues and recognize that character is not disconnected from community. These are always concepts, always in relationship and in iteration together. So I think recognizing that for me does make it a civic project, both personally, I think, and also I think socially. How do we shape people to be the kinds of citizens we need to make our democracy flourish and our human society flourish beyond just our own political communities?
So let's talk a little bit about the kind of work you're doing at Wake Forest and elsewhere that you could describe as this civic project in terms of educating leaders and citizens for the future. And before we talk about what it is you're actually doing, over the past 5-6 years, it seems from the outside, conversations around character and virtue are easier to have. They're easier to have in the public sphere. They're easier to have on campuses. Is that something that you're experiencing? Is this or for you, has this always been something that everybody is willing to jump in and have a conversation about?
I think it has been easier in some ways the last few years. And I think people who might have been skeptical of character or concerned about what it might mean have become more open to it. I think part of that is because I think we see in our public life pretty conspicuous examples of people without character. And we realize why it's really important that we need certain virtues such as honesty and humility and justice and empathy, and how those kind of virtues can shape leadership in a very profound way. So I do think public examples of the lack of character is really important. Richard Reeves, who has written about character, says that character, like oxygen, is most noticeable when it's missing. I think we've been missing some character. So I think it's easy to see it and recognize, oh, if we care about having leaders and citizens who do embody these virtues, we need to actually do more work in higher education to help form this next generation of leaders and citizens. So I think that's one crucial part of that work. And I do think it has been easier to do that work given the lack of character in public life that we might notice.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about what you've been up to at Wake Forest? Some extraordinary work, some great recent news. Maybe you could just share a bit about what's been happening and what you're doing.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, we have a great team at Wake Forest who are doing work on leadership and character there. We have had for the last 12 years faculty in our university who've done really excellent work on the psychology and philosophy of character with major grants that study character and its development. And that's been a huge foundation for our own work at Wake Forest to really build on that and take that research and then apply it in ways that help students develop character. So we've been offering a scholarship program for students to come into Wake Forest and be really engaged in character for 4 years. We offer retreats and discussion groups. We offer courses ourselves as faculty on character. I teach a great course I love. It's called Commencing Character, How Should We Live? And it pairs the study of character with commencement speeches on different virtues. And students at the very end of the course give their own speech about their vision of what a good life is. So it's been a ton of fun to teach, and students are so engaged in that course. We also train faculty in different disciplines to integrate leadership character into their courses through modules or new syllabi. And so that's been a really encouraging process, seeing faculty from across the university take ideas, see how they're already doing this work in many ways in their own courses, and can use that framework and language to then sort of help achieve their own learning objectives in ways that are really more integrated into their own curricular objectives. So that's been a really exciting way to see people in law, medicine, history, literature, psychology, communication, and philosophy and other fields really do the work to develop new courses around character. I know you're doing that work with a great workshop this summer around that at Notre Dame to help faculty really try to understand these concepts, to own them and translate them into their own context. We also been finding ways to engage a larger community through conferences. We've partnered with the Oxford Character Project the last 4 years to have conferences on character and virtue that have been international in scope. We had one this past December. As you know, you were there on educating character across the university, and we brought together people from around the university to understand that, and also around the country to think about ways that character can be educated in different contexts. Character is not a one-size-fits-all concept. It really requires being attuned to different cultural and institutional contexts. And so we want to learn from other people how they're doing that work, and then figure out ways we can support that work around higher education. So we just received a grant this month, actually, from the Lilly Endowment. We're very grateful to for their support of this grant to support our program at Wake Forest, but also to be a national hub for a network in higher education that will offer more conferences, resources, and even grants to other institutions to develop character in their own context. And so we think that we can actually be someone who supports this movement in higher education and who can learn from other institutions doing this work in their own contexts, be it public or private, large or small. And so we're excited about that new initiative to really expand this work in higher education, and been very encouraged by the number of people who have been doing this work at their own institutions like Notre Dame, for example, or who have aspirations to do this work but need support to make it possible. And so we're very encouraged about that grant and what it might allow us to do in higher education. We also have grants to really advance our research. We've had one from the Templeton Foundation to really help us understand the role of exemplars in character education, and one from the Kern Family Foundation to think about the ways we can extend this work into professional and pre-professional education. So how can we help train doctors and lawyers and other professionals, engineers, to be people of character and to let that character infuse their own cultures and their institutions and organizations. So we're trying to think about ways in which we can use this work and really apply it in ways that extend beyond just our university, but helps other universities sort of take it and then learn from it and then use it in their own ways, in their own context, to shape their students and faculty and staff.
So this is all just fabulous, really tremendous work that you're doing. And I think one of the things that I think is so interesting about the work you do is sort of, right, there is this incredibly wonderfully rich work of political theory in the work around Augustine, and then you're putting it into action in the classroom and in training of future students, citizens, and leaders. What's hard about this? Right? Right from the outside, it's like, wow, like they've got it down. Like, what is hard? Like, where are the challenges that you face in doing this work? Right? Are there folks who push against it? Whether they're faculty or students? Like, is any of the, like, what's hard?
Well, there's a lot about that's hard, and I think in many ways Aristotle says that virtue is about the difficult and the good. If it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth calling virtue. And so I think if we do care about these things, we do have to think about ways we can respond to difficulties. And I think in our context, what we've been very encouraged by is how many people, once they understand character, really embrace it. I think one challenge we have is that character has been co-opted by different groups in the past to mean different things. And I think one challenge is having enough sort of awareness of what character can be. That's not maybe what people think it is. So we've done a lot of work, for example, to show the ways that character can be really compatible with work to include diversity, equity, inclusion in higher education. If we care about those important values and aims, and we need to think about ways that virtues like humility and empathy and justice and courage might support that work. They've often been part of two different discourses. We're trying to bring them together to show the ways they're relevant to each other. So I do think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what character might be. And I think once we've actually been able to share our vision of that, I think some of the concerns sort of fall away. And I think people really see how it does align with their own vision of what education can be. I think another challenge is, how do you also do this work in ways that empowers others to do it? So we really thought a lot about how do we have enough that's in common in our frameworks to add coherence, but also to allow real freedom and flexibility from faculty and staff in different parts of the university to take this work and apply it in their own ways, and to be creative in their own ways to do this work that aligns with their own objectives. And so I think that sort of combination of coherence and flexibility is one constant challenge we're always grappling with. And I think I'll just say, we really care about building meaningful partnerships. We know that character really is formed in community, and through a culture that values it. And so we've really been grateful to have partners who are really invested in this work alongside us. And I think building those partnerships takes time, and it takes real effort and intentionality. And so I think if you hope to have a character program overnight, it's not going to be possible without that partnership. And I think lastly, I'll say is that character is not something that can be done overnight. And one reason it's hard is it requires us to really confront our own character in ways and be honest about that, and to journey with students in the process. What we've learned from our program so far is that what really makes a difference with students and their character formation is not just a one-time event, or no matter how great the speaker is, your character is not often shaped usually by one speaker event. It's shaped over time through rigorous intellectual engagement, and especially through care. We found that students report that the most impactful factor on their character formation is the care of their mentors and of their peers. And that's been the key feature of our work. And so I think what that means is we really try to care, and care to do it well can be hard. It's time consuming, it's difficult, it requires a lot of attention, and it means it requires a lot of staff and support to do it well. And so I think that's one challenge we have, is how do we have the context of care that makes character possible, while also recognizing our limits financially, institutionally, even related to personnel, that we don't sort of risk burnout or exhaustion of that care. And so I think that tension between how do you provide enough care is really critical. And I think as we think about character in higher education, I think it's really important to recognize the ways in which we can't just have these programs that are superficial. We have to have ways that actually go deep with students and with ourselves to really try to have the impact that lasts beyond just one lecture or one course, but really changes a life. And I think that requires a lot of care and a lot of attention, and that's hard work. And I think it's also very meaningful work. So it is both difficult and good, and therefore I think a really proper object of what virtue ought to be about.
So I love that attention to the notion of care, right? And sort of it's care through the journey. Faculty good at care, right? I can imagine a lot of faculty feeling uncomfortable about the notion of care. Right? Faculty have expertise, they have knowledge, they have skills. Or, right? Do you find faculty are good at that, want to do that, scared of that?
Yeah, I think I've been very encouraged. Wake Forest has terrific faculty, and we really prioritize teaching in our institution. And so we have the teacher scholar model, and teacher comes first for a reason, because we really aspire to be teachers first and let that teaching shape who we are in the world. So I do think that what I've really seen in our faculty, my colleagues, has been a real tremendous care for our students. And I also say that's been the same in our staff. You know, I think staff are really important parts of the educational institution of university. And often we think about faculty and scholars and research, but I think the staff that I see also doing this work in counseling centers and residence halls and in civic engagement offices, places like what you lead at Notre Dame, Suzanne. In our program, our staff and our faculty both have been so committed to caring. And so what I've really been inspired by is how committed they are to care, which takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and it can be emotionally exhausting to do that well. Students have tremendous challenges, and to really show up for them is quite hard, I think, but that's where I see the most change. And so I think that's really crucial. And also, I just want to say, I've been reading Parker Palmer's The Courage to Teach recently. And the need to also do that work in ourselves is so vital. And I think that it's easy to think about how we become dispensers of knowledge, or just sort of sharing our expertise without recognizing the ways that we also are being shaped in the process. And we have to own our own limitations and our own aspirations as we do that work. So I do think being more, holistic is something that I think faculty at Wake Forest really embody really well. And I've been very encouraged by that, and also see that hunger among other faculty around the country who have been doing this work, and see it changes teaching. It makes teaching, I think, much more meaningful and more exciting. And I think students are engaged in a different kind of way when they can apply what they're learning to their own life. I found on student evaluations or in student emails after a class that students say, wow, this class was relevant to my life, and I was so much more engaged because it was relevant to my life. And so for me as a teacher, to be part of that journey, to witness their own unfolding in that way is so meaningful to me. And I think gives me a sense that what we do really is invaluable to our own lives and to theirs. And so I think that kind of teaching, I think, can not only be effective, it also can help transform us as teachers and help us see what we find meaningful about the work that we value.
Great. So it's interesting. I was part of a conversation with the folks in engineering here this morning, and we're talking about these issues in the context of Notre Dame engineering. Where does one begin?
Mm.
Sort of want to do this. What's step one?
Yeah, I think it's identifying relevant faculty partners who really care about it and want to do it. We need people who are actually motivated to do it. So identifying those people, and then finding the easy ways that they're already doing this work in their classroom. Whether we know it or not, we're always shaping character in the classroom by what we value, how we ourselves model good or bad character in the classroom, what we assign as being of importance, and how even we engage students in conversation. That often can involve humility or arrogance. It can involve empathy, or it can involve indifference. So I think just recognizing the ways we're already doing it and finding easy ways in. We've had some really good work with our engineering department, who's been so creative and committed to this work at Wake Forest, and just seeing the ways that they would take, for example, an assignment and or group project, and then integrate the virtue of teamwork into it, and have them think about what teamwork is. So it adds kind of another layer onto what they're already doing, but it made the assignment totally different, and it kind of transformed the assignment. So how do you, rather than sort of finding new ways to create new courses or even new requirements, how do you already infuse what they're already doing with this lens? So for example, if being a team member requires accountability and honesty, how do you ask students to reflect on that in their process? Not just write their group project, but reflect on accountability and their own strengths and weaknesses in that. So there are ways to kind of layer it on that I think is really helpful, and making it sort of a first step into the process.
Great. So some of the questions are teeing up, so I'm going to turn to them now.
Great.
The first one, it seems right that presumption is a fallacy, but it may be too strong to call it a vice. It doesn't seem to be nearly as harmful as despair. What's your thinking there?
Well, I think it depends on what we mean by presumption and despair. I think despair can be quite dangerous, but also I think what happens with presumption is that we become prideful about things, and we presume, for example, that we have authority or we have the ability to do some things that we might not have. And I think if you look at the history, Augustine's very concerned, for example, about how pride can lead to a lust for glory or honor, and therefore a lust for domination. If we want to achieve so that we actually are the strongest, or we're the most powerful, or we're the best, we can then sort of try to conquer people or dominate them to show that we have more power, we have more strength. So the way in which presumption can also lead to domination, if we presume that we can act without accountability of the law or the democratic community, for example, we can do things that violate the law and perhaps dominate other people. We can presume that we are always right and therefore not willing to learn from others, or that our actions might be the best, even when they might not be. And so I think if you look at recent political events, if we presume the pandemic wasn't so bad, and that's, we don't need to wear a mask, we don't need to actually have a vaccine, then we would have caused a lot more deaths in that process. If just by the presumption that we might have that we don't need to change in this context. I think climate change the same way. We might despair about it, but also we presume that it's not so bad, and we can keep living as we're living. Then I think we're going to face real devastation in a critical way. So I think both are dangerous vices, and I think in different contexts can affect others differently. I think those with power and privilege are often more tempted toward presumption. Mm-hmm. Because they have more power and they can presume, therefore, they can achieve certain goods without help or without any difficulty. Those who've been denied power or voice are often tempted toward despair because they know how hard it is to actually overcome these challenges. So I think each might be tempted by different vices, and with the alert to ways in which those vices might actually affect different groups and positionalities differently.
Great, thank you. You have drawn a lot on Augustine in the writing about hope. Are there other authors or theologians that have been influential in your thinking about hope as well? Maybe that you would recommend to our audience as resources on hope?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, my first introduction to hope as a concept was from my undergraduate professor of philosophy, Patrick Shade. He wrote a book called Habits of Hope. It was a pragmatist account of hope. And so I was really thinking about the ways in which his account of habits might connect with virtue, and really how we might take a more individualistic focused kind of habits and extend it more socially. And he does this some into the book, but I want to kind of think about the political implications of our habits of hope. So that was one way I got into this work, was through my undergraduate professor, Patrick Shade, who's a terrific scholar and teacher. Also, I've done a lot of work on Thomas Aquinas, who really does have a similar idea of hope as a virtue and makes some of the distinctions a bit more precise in his work. That can be helpful for us. And also I've done work recently on Wendell Berry, who I think is a really interesting contemporary exemplar of a kind of realistic hope related to our environmental challenges. I think Berry really does, in his own work, in his writing, and in his life, sort of embody a kind of hope that is not presumptuous about our challenges. It's very critical of our current situation, but always ends his essays with grounds for hope.
Right.
And I had a chance to interview Barry once at his kitchen table in Kentucky, and have a chapter coming out about that interview and his work in the year to come. But I was so struck by how he intentionally sees himself as like a jazz musician, trying to sort of improvise his way from this critical analysis of our current moment to finally end up with a more hopeful stance that might empower his readers and his citizens to do work to address the problems he's diagnosed. I think that kind of improvisational jazz approach to finding hope through all the difficulty, I think, is really inspiring. And we need more of that now in our contemporary discourse.
So one of the things that as you describe, Barry, you have this, and it reminds me to a certain extent of how you articulate your work. There's this extraordinary humility. How does humility fit into your conceptualization? I think you embody an extraordinary humility. I think Barry does as well. Where does that fit?
Yeah, well, thanks, Suzanne. I think humility is vital, and if the two vices that oppose hope are presumption and despair, then we need other virtues to help us avoid those vices too. We need them cooperating with hope to avoid those vices, and humility, I think, is the critical one for avoiding presumption. We need to be aware of our own limitations, our own weaknesses, how biases affect us and what we try to do, and aware that we also can't do it all on our own. We need other people to help us. And I think one crucial part of Augustine's virtue that's often ignored is that we not only hope for certain objects, but hope in other people. For him, it's God or neighbor to achieve certain objects of our hope. And I think in our contemporary democratic life, we often forget the need to hope in our fellow citizens to achieve certain democratic goods. And I think humility recognizes that we can't do it on our own. We need other support, and we have to be aware of the real risk and limitations, and then be open to hearing other people's voices and ideas for how we might achieve difficult democratic goods. So that humility involved in listening, of building relationships and collaboration to achieve common hopes, as well as chasing our own presumptions in ways that might cause us to ignore the need for that democratic collaboration.
Great. Next question. Along with Augustine's emphasis on hope, you also find an emphasis on God's providence. Is there a connection between the two?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Augustine does believe that God is providential, and that there's a way in which God's providence has shaped what he thinks, and it's always gets grounds, he thinks, for Christians to have hope that there will be a kind of a redemption and a kind of city of God. And so I think in that sense, his hope in God is really crucial to how he grounds his theological hope. But there's a really interesting sermon, actually an interesting treatise he responds to in a treatise that's kind of like a letter back to these monks who are asking Augustine, you've mentioned God's grace and providence. How do we teach God's providence if teaching God's providence means that people think that their fate's already sealed? They're either going to heaven or going to hell. How do we teach it if providence suggests that this has already been determined, right? And Augustine has a very interesting response back saying, well, actually, God may be providential in that way, but we don't know. And so we can't just presume that we're going to heaven or to hell for him theologically. And so we have to also teach them to keep trying to manifesting the kind of love that would embody virtue. And so I think in that sense, he might think that providence does ground hope, but we also have to make sure that we manifest hope for God and for neighbor in our life. And I think it's really important. One thing to note in Augustine's thought that I really try to do a lot with in the book is show that his focus on the city of God in our minds often sort of suggests heaven after time or after our own life. But he thinks about city of God in a somewhat different way, where we're always, even now, can participate in that city as we move along. And so if embodying virtue hope, love, or faith is the way we actually achieve, or not achieve, but actually participate in the city of God, then doing that work now can actually help us to inhabit those virtues even before any sort of afterlife. And so I think in that context, manifesting the virtues of hope, faith, and love for Augustine is a way to not only to maybe manifest what he thinks might be God's providence, but to participate in that unfolding city of God that he identifies as crucial to order human life.
Wonderful. So here are two questions that sort of try to stretch Augustine's thinking. So you said one can hope for good things or for bad things, that there are other virtues necessary for controlling hope. So why is hope good and something that we should desire to do virtuously or well? Why not just dismiss hope and focus on greater virtues that control it? And then second question, just because only a few minutes left, how does one address the socio-political dynamics presently between who is right versus what is true? And can Augustine provide insight there?
Good question. Yeah. So I might take the first one first. And I think that Augustine kind of addresses this question in his little book called The Enchiridion. And in several sermons, we talks about why faith and love really depend on hope. You might think that, well, faith's enough, and therefore we don't need hope. And actually, some people have criticized hope as a virtue and said, no, faith is enough. Vincent Lloyd has a book called The Problem with Grace, where he kind of says hope is really only a rhetorical technique. Faith is really our key virtue that we need. But I think what that ignores is that faith, at least in Augustine's conception, can be inert. We might believe or trust something, but not be motivated to act on that trust or that belief toward a good. So we need something that kind of motivates us, because hope provides sort of a movement of the will. Our action is inspired by hope for a future outcome or future good. And without that, he says that faith can falter. You can stop walking on the road of faith because you don't hope to achieve the end. So I do think that hope is critical for that work, and that if we do, hope also requires, for example, humility, and it requires justice and requires fortitude or courage to achieve it. But we also can't achieve those virtues ourselves without hoping that we can actually develop them in ourselves. So I think hope, all these virtues are connected in certain ways, where hope requires them to perfect this work, but that also these other virtues require hope to achieve difficult goods. If we know what justice is and have the virtue of justice, but can't hope for its actual achievement in our world, then we won't actually do justice. So hope's going to be critical to even achieving those important virtues and goods. Can you remind me the last question about what is right and what is true?
Yeah, so how does one address the social political dynamics presently between who is right versus what is true?
I think my sense of that question is really asking, how does claims about who is right connect with what is true? And how do we know that? And I think that's where I think a lot of humility is required, both in our own assessments of what is right and what is true, and how we also engage those who have claims about that. And so I do think right now, if we can really focus on what is true and be open to pursuing that, even if it might mean we're wrong, I think that's crucial, right? So what is true? And also recognizing the different ways that truth can unfold and have many sides to it. And I think that's also requires some humility to recognize that there may be truths that actually might reveal themselves differently in different ways. So I do think humility becomes the key to that. And that humility requires not only our own assessment of ourselves, but also listening to others who might claim they have the truth or raise questions about what we think is right. We can also learn truth not by recognizing what we might have wrong. So I think there are ways in which humility becomes a crucial virtue for that effort.
Wonderful. So, and as we just sort of close things up, what would you suggest we read? So a work of fiction and a work of nonfiction. And you can't say your own book, even though
That's a great question. I've really been, for teachers out there, I think The Courage to Teach that I've been reading recently is really excellent. And it helps us think about what teaching means as more than just this transmission of knowledge, and more about the transformation of the human soul or the human mind and heart. So that's been a very important influence on me. And I also think as far as fiction goes, I think right now, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein It's a really interesting novel. I've taught it several times to students in different groups, and I always love reading it because it really always brings up new ways to think about both humility and empathy. And as we think about the shifts in AI from that we've seen in recent weeks and months and years, I think what is the way we think about humility, and how is the so-called monsters character formed by that? And I've been really attuned to ways in which the so-called monster has also had a kind of formation of character in a very explicit way throughout that novel, and what it tells about who we are as the formers of that character and how his character has been shaped. And I think there's a lot about how he is treated unjustly based on appearances that he can't control, from skin color to size and others, that actually has a lot of lessons for us now as we think about how we do justice and practice kind of sympathy and empathy and humility that I think Mary Shelley recommends.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And thank everybody who's joined us for this hour. Please join us again Monday, February 13th with physician and professor Margaret Pluzogan on wisdom and medicine. Thank you, Michael. This was a real treat.
Great. It was a great joy. Thank you so much.
And congratulations on all the hard work. Yeah, just really magnificent.
Thank you.